Okay, welcome to British and American Culture, Week 3. This is actually the makeup lecture, which was scheduled for last Saturday, but we're only now catching up to what was happening because of the 2-week delay. Today we're going to talk about the Normans, the Middle Ages, from the Normans until the Tudors take over at the end of the 15th century. First of all, I need to correct myself because I made a couple of mistakes with dates, and I told you I do not require you to remember dates for this class, although there are certain specific dates that we will talk about and you do need to remember. One of them is going to be talked about today. However, the ones that I mentioned last week, I fluffed on them because I thought I knew, but I didn't. So first of all, Julius Caesar invaded Great Britain, which was not Great Britain. He invaded Albion, the territory which would become Britain later and England later, in 55 BC. Then the Roman conquest officially kicked off in AD 43, or 43 of the Common Era, which was spearheaded by generals, but the figurehead of the emperor was there. Emperor Claudius was the one politically in charge. You don't have to remember that, as I said. Really, just remember the Romans started taking over around 0 AD, and then they didn't leave until 400 AD around. That's what I care about. Remember, I said, just try and remember the order. So Celts were there. They were called the Britons. Romans came in. Julius Caesar was the first, and then Emperor Claudius actually conquered the territory starting in 43 AD, but that took decades to do. It took about 30 years. And then then it became a sort of Roman culture on top, but as I said, the people themselves were mostly still Britons. Probably less than 10%, or maybe even closer to 5 or 3% of the population was actually Roman, like from Italy or other territories in the Roman Empire. And I guessed completely wrong about Abraham Lincoln's speech. I don't know why I couldn't guess that properly, but it was 1863 that he made the Gettysburg Address. I said 1861 or 1862, but that's not accurate. So don't worry too much about the dates. I didn't, so you don't have to either. Secondly, some students have subscribed to this channel, which I appreciate because that supports my effort and makes this channel more popular on YouTube. It's not a requirement or even necessarily related to the class. The only concern I have is just remember that you need to log into the CNU portal and use your student ID and then go to my website and click on the link and then watch the video. Subscribing is just an extra thing, and you can watch any of the videos that I make from other classes too for free. So if you subscribe, that's great. It supports me if I get enough subscribers. I think probably some of you are aware that you need a lot of subscribers to get anything in terms of money. It really doesn't add up until you have thousands, if not more than that, tuning in. So I just want to say thank you very much to the people who subscribe, and that's fine. But remember, to get credit for your class, the attendance is all controlled through the CNU administration. So you need to make sure that you use the portal and go through that gateway and connect to YouTube through the cyber lecture every time. I changed the length of time by request again from the administration because it was set at 60 minutes because normally we have 2 hours of class and 1 hour online, but now we're doing 3 hours a week online. So 1 hour really doesn't cover what you should be absorbing. So the timer is adjusted. So just remember, the first week was 60 minutes. It's not an error or some kind of mistake. It's intentional. You need to be logged into the website through the portal for 90 minutes, then you get credit for your attendance. If you do not do that, then there's nothing I can do to verify that you have done your work. So one, please log in through the CNU portal and spend your 90 minutes. Subscription is just your choice, and I appreciate people who do that, but that doesn't matter. And make sure that you tune in to listen to everything I say, because this video lecture is the number one thing you need to pay attention to. I would say if you're going to focus on anything, focus on this video lecture. I always say to my students that I collect everything that I put on the website and in the slides and in the textbook, those three sources, and I collect them and I sort of deliver what I want you to focus on through class, which is this. Normally would be in a room, but instead it's me talking by myself to my phone or my webcam. I got a new one today, so we'll be doing it through the camera. But this is what you need to pay attention to. Like I said, 66 students are in this class, so there isn't a whole lot of interaction anyway. Sometimes people ask questions, which I really appreciate, because I like people to ask questions and I like to have interaction with the class, but because the class is so big, usually it's mostly me talking, and then at the end of class, a few students ask me questions, and then the next lecture, I usually answer their questions individually, and then the next lecture, I share that information with everyone. So if you have questions about things, some students have sent a few questions already, not in this class per se, but in other classes, and I will address them when I speak to you here, or I will write something on the cyber lecture to cover what they said or what they asked. Okay? So now that we're through that, I'll try not to drone on for an hour like I did last time, but we do have a certain amount of material to cover, so I'll do it as efficiently as I can. We are going to rewind a little bit. This lecture is, sometimes I call this Kings in the Middle Ages, because I want to talk about the Middle Ages and the Normans and some events that happened, and we have to cover all of that. But I do want to talk about individuals and what their effect has been on history, because there are some particular people, especially kings, that their personalities and their behavior and their decisions and their relationships and so on, like I said, their social context, what they did and what happened around them at the time was very significant and changed the course of history in some cases. They had huge influences. You know, part of what I want you to understand today is that one of the best things about this class is to understand culture, right? This is a cultural studies class, and we are postmodern people. I don't think there's a better, you can call us 21st century people. Our lives revolve around completely different things. Like this, what we're doing right now, would have been impossible 100 years ago. When the Spanish flu pandemic, spread all over the world and killed millions of people, because that was the last time I think that something on this scale has happened. There was no way for a professor to deliver lectures to somebody. If you wanted to go to university, you would have had to wear a mask and goggles and gloves and sprayed yourself and sat in class and risked being close to everyone else. You would not have been able to connect with me like this. This is something that we take for granted now. You are younger than me, so you don't realize, maybe, you probably do realize, but you didn't grow up just knowing that Google or Naver or Facebook or Instagram was not at your fingertips. Whenever you wanted to see something or you wanted to know something, you just touched it and it came to you. When I was young, that was not possible. So you need to adjust your way of thinking. You need to think about how different it was back then. In some ways, the culture is very, very similar. And some things you can look back in 1,000 years ago in England and say, wow, like, these things, humans don't change in some respects, right? How about in terms of listening to the government and doing what the government says? I think some of you probably have seen, I hope. If you haven't, check it out. The Italian mayors just ranting and raving on YouTube in broadcasts because they're so angry that young people are not listening to what they're saying, and they're going out and partying and going to clubs. Same thing's happening in Korea. Same thing's happening in the United States. Spring break happened. Everybody went to the beach. And people are like, what is wrong with those people? Well, they're young. And that's what young people do. And that's what young people did 1,000 years ago. When they got worked up and they got excited and they wanted to do stuff, they thought they were invincible. Sometimes they fought people. Sometimes they partied. They didn't listen to the older people. And the government had a choice. Cracking down, restricting, fighting. We're going to talk about this today. And all those things, they were around. And the balance that has been created in British culture and American culture has come over time. Because a long time ago, it was really up to the king in some ways to just crack down hard and make everybody do exactly what he wanted. Or to do what was popular. Or to just... In some cases, it was just the king wasn't strong enough to, impose his will. So the people started doing things, and he was unable to crack down, control, force the population to do what he wanted. The compromise between the population, the upper class, what we call commoners, people with money, foreigners, and domestic people at home. This delicate balance sometimes got upended many times, but through the course, and this is what I mean by evolution, right? Evolution and revolution. Through the course of British history, especially, and American as a kind of an offshoot originally of British. I'll explain what I mean about that much later in the course, but British and American culture does have sort of this development over time of checks and balances to power and to representation by different portions of the population. And you can see sometimes the scales start to tip too far in one direction, and the rich people get too much power, or the king gets too much power, or, the poor people get too much power. It's going to happen over and over. And this happens throughout the Middle Ages, and it happens now. So we always have to be aware of that delicate balance between who has the power over what. And that's partly what I meant when I explained to you about the relationship between dominant culture, subculture, and counterculture. There's always this tension between these groups, and they can change over time. So let's get right into it. I want to talk about Alfred first, and I want to talk about Arthur. So the difference between Alfred and Arthur is King Arthur is probably one of the people that you know, along with somebody like Robin Hood, and we're going to talk about him in a minute too. But we don't really have any solid evidence. It's all speculation about whether there was a King Arthur or not. Some people think there probably was somebody like that, some sort of war leader or chieftain. There's some evidence that King Arthur, the person that was like King Arthur was maybe the leader of a Celtic tribe. When the Romans left, they may have been somewhat Romanized, but he was a Celtic person probably, who fought against the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. So the Germans, as I told you, when the Romans left, not the real Romans, but the people that belonged to the Roman Empire and could withdraw. They couldn't bring everybody. Not everybody left. Just the government, the soldiers, and the richest Roman people left. Some of them were probably part British too, part Britain. They all withdrew by 410 AD, And so once they were gone, there was a power vacuum. There was normally a garrison, a legion in Britain that was about 5,000 strong. So 5,000 soldiers who were trained and their job was to police the whole country essentially left. So all of a sudden, it's a pretty soft target. There's really no army or police or defense. So these Angles and Jutes and the Scots and the Picts, come over from Ireland and from Scotland, what will become Scotland, which was Hibernia was Ireland, and Scotland up there, not Scottish yet, but the people called the Scots would settle there. They're all taking advantage. So the society starts to collapse and like move west. So you end up, now we have part of the United Kingdom called Wales, and I can't get into it now because there's so many things to talk about, but sort of the western section, the very western section, close to Ireland, continues to be now Wales. They have their own language and they have their own culture. They almost all of them speak English perfectly, but a lot of them do speak what's called Welsh, but it's a sort of Celtic language. It's distant cousins with Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic. And in the very corner of the bottom southwest, there's a place called where the Cornish live, and those Cornish people, on the very tip of the corner in the Atlantic Ocean, they also managed to preserve a lot of their Celtic heritage. And I've never met somebody from there, but I heard Cornish is very, very difficult to understand because it's so different from English. It's essentially a dialect of Gaelic almost. It's very distinct. That's all I know about them. I'd like to visit someday, but I have not yet. I've only been to London, so that's all I can speak about from personal experience. So King Arthur, when these Britons were being pushed westward by the German tribes that were invading and settling and taking over just by pure numbers, we don't know how violent it was, but there was definitely battles. Supposedly there was a person that delayed this expansion and invasion by perhaps a few generations. So that might have been the origin of the Arthur legend, which the British people used later to unify everyone. But the key point about Arthur is, first of all, he's not real. It's a myth. Second of all, they give him all these attributes, he was handsome, charismatic, he had the round table, he had all these super warriors called the Knights of the Round Table, Lancelot, Percival, Galahad, all these other things. He was in a way almost like a biblical person, like King David. He had some faults, but he was essentially an idealized king. So every king after that was compared to this idealized king, Arthur, who probably didn't ever exist. So they made up all these stories about this perfect king, almost perfect king. His wife did cheat on him later and stuff, but that was not part of the original story, supposedly. So he was this great warrior, and he was this dedicated Christian and everything. He was likely, in real life, not a Christian. So all of these things got added later. The point about Arthur is that he is like a superhero, kind of. He has all the qualities that everybody would like to have. And if you're a king, you want to be as similar to Arthur as possible, or you want the English people or the Irish people or the Scottish people to think you are basically Arthur. Henry VIII and any number of other kings, once the story became super popular, they all wanted to be considered, the Arthur of their time. So King Arthur is a really important figure, but not actually a historical one like Yi Sun-shin or Napoleon or Julius Caesar. He didn't actually exist, or at least not in the way that he exists in the story. He's more of a character and a figure, not a real person. So let's leave him behind. But mainly the function of Arthur is to help consolidate. He was actually a Briton, but he was claimed later by the Normans and by English people and by British people. He's really, if anything, he's probably closer to being Welsh than anything else. But the kings of England do have Welsh blood. They have blood from everywhere. They're all mixed up. They've got all kinds of mixed up genetics. Most people call, the queen, not most people, I shouldn't say that. A lot of people say she's half German. And we'll talk about that much later, but she's somewhat representative of what many, genetically what many people are in England, which is a bit of everything. And Arthur became a symbol of unity, became a British symbol. He's a British king, not a Celtic king, not a Danish king, not exactly a Norman king or a German king either. He's supposed to help unify everybody. So this is one of the functions of Arthur, is to help get all of these various people who are all mixed together to connect to each other and think of themselves as one people, which is it was a very difficult task. And he was one of the strategies. He was one of the ways that people later used. Okay, so that's Arthur. He was probably, if he was alive, it was probably around the 5th century when the Germans were invading. Now, after him, I want to talk about Alfred, King Alfred. He has the unique title of being, the unique reputation of being the only great king. And I'm going to have to disagree with that restriction to only him, because I think Queen Elizabeth I probably should be called Queen Elizabeth the Great as well. And there's a few other candidates too. I won't be able to get into most of them too much, but I have other kings that you could consider great too. But in Korea, there's only two. Sejong the Great and Gwanggaeto. Gwanggaeto is more of a warrior king, and Sejong is more of a philosopher king, enlightened. But he also, supposedly had a skill for generalship too. So, Sejong is one of those kings or people that you consider, multi-talented, politically talented, interested in science and language and society, quite balanced person. And that's why he gets to be called Sejong the Great. Most people don't know about Gwanggaeto as much, but he defeated gigantic Chinese military invasion and saved Korea perhaps from being completely different and absorbed by the Chinese. So he also gets to be called the Great. So Alfred is more of a Sejong type guy, but he lived around the time that the Viking invasions, the Danes were invading, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, there were 7 of them, and he was king of only one, the kingdom of Wessex, which is kind of basically in the south central area. So basically the Vikings took over the entire island, except for his little pocket, his one kingdom. All the kingdoms went down. The other kingdoms, Mercia, Northumbria, had been stronger than his kingdom, but, and I don't have time to explain to you too much about him, but he was down the line in terms of who was going to be king next. Alfred was, I'm going to mess this up, the 4th son? He was not first, second, or third. He might have been the 5th. But there was several of his older brothers in front of him. So he was not expecting to become the king. And nobody else expected him to either. But when he was really young, perhaps because he was not number 1, 2, or 3, he wasn't expected to be taking over, his father had him go to Rome on a pilgrimage, which is a super big deal. It's going to Rome from England at that time, in around 800 AD, past Vikings and through all of these different kingdoms and stuff with all the possible danger and diseases and everything. All that stuff, you have to go all the way there. It's thousands of kilometers by horse and foot and boat. Very dangerous. He went all the way to Rome, met the Pope, and was blessed by the Pope, and then came all the way back and didn't get killed or get injured or anything. He made it all the way home as a little boy. And then his older brothers died, but from various things. So he became king because his father died and his older brothers died. And looking back, everybody said, well, that's because it was his destiny, right? He made it all the way to Rome and all the way back. That was a crazy journey. God protected him, and his whole family died except for him. So this is meant to be. So he had this kind of Arthurian, Arthur is a boy and he pulls the sword of the stone, and nobody else can, even these great big knights that are famous and strong can't pull the sword out. So when Arthur does it, that means God has chosen him to be the king. This is the kind of thing that, people retroactively applied to Alfred. So he became sort of almost a legend in his own time, even when he was young, because he took over. Supposedly he wasn't really like a healthy, strong individual. He always had some health issues, but I guess that was one of the reasons everybody thought, well, he's sickly and weak, but he can't be killed. So maybe that's God watching over him. Julius Caesar's heir, Caesar Augustus, was also similar. The guy was sick all the time, but then he lived until he was almost 80 years old. And how did they explain that? Well, because the gods protected him, because Augustus was meant to take over the Roman Empire and become the first citizen and be the first emperor of Rome. That was meant to be. The gods kept him alive, and he kept himself alive through his own energy and good luck. So Alfred did the same thing. He almost lost his kingdom. He was barely able to stop the Vikings from destroying Wessex, but he hung on with a small group of warriors. He hid in a swamp, and then he managed to start consolidating and building up some forts, and then responding to the Viking raids effectively. So he started to make this network of defense. So he's very talented militarily, and he started to organize everything. He was a really good administrator. He started recording people's names and where they lived, and checking everybody's economic contribution and taxing people fairly. Supposedly he always went to church. He was very pious, right? He prayed all the time. He was a good Christian. I mean, this almost sounds like too good to be true. I know. This is why I'm comparing him to Arthur and why he's called Alfred the Great, because he saved the country from the Vikings. He was a dedicated Christian guy. He reorganized his entire kingdom and then expanded it and improved the economic situation. He tried to develop the navy and build boats. He liked the arts and music and literature. So, this is a Sejong type guy. He was good at everything. He was multi-talented, and he applied himself with a lot of energy to all the projects that he tried to undertake. And when the Normans came, they tried to bury his name and suppress it, because everybody looked at Alfred as if he was like an Arthur type person, and the Normans didn't like Anglo-Saxons to have heroes. It's the same reason, that Yi Sun-shin was suppressed, because Yi Sun-shin is a hero, and the colonial Japanese government, of course, didn't want Koreans to act like heroes. So they didn't want stories of amazing heroism spread around and people growing up trying to be like Yi Sun-shin. Yi Sun-shin was really resurrected as a national figure for Korea in the Park Chung-hee era. Some people don't know that. Isenchin apparently is not popular in North Korea for a number of reasons, but I won't get into that. But Isenchin is basically every young Korean's hero, including my son, and also my favorite Korean hero. So Alfred the Great is one of those people that could be chosen. He's certainly the greatest. He gets the title of the Great for that reason, and he is by far the greatest Anglo-Saxon king. So that's why I'm talking about him and comparing him to Arthur. So now let's jump forward. In the textbook, they talk about King Canute. I don't want to make this lecture extremely long, so I will let you read about King Canute yourself. But basically, after Alfred, the kings weren't nearly as talented as him. So the Anglo-Saxon kingdom got stronger and stronger to a point, and then the Vikings started to wear it down again. And instead of having an Alfred, they had other guys, like Ethelred the Unruly. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but unready is usually what we say, but it's not unready. It actually means ill-advised. So people like that, young kings that were inexperienced and indecisive and scared of Vikings, quite frankly, I think. They didn't lead the country well, so they ended up actually having Danish kings, several. King Canute was the most powerful of them. He was he was the king about 50 years before the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. So they kind of go back and forth. I know we try to keep these separated. So we're talking about the Viking period really didn't take over England completely, except for in the north, where Alfred just made a deal where you could control the northern part of England, and we'll say that's the Danish area, that's the Viking area, that's called the Danelaw. You guys stay up there, and you leave the bottom half of the country to us, and that's how they worked it out. But around 1000 AD, King Canute became the king of Denmark, parts of Sweden, Scotland, and England at the same time, which has never happened before or since. They call this brief period the North Sea Empire, and I did a little write-up about him in the book, so you can check out what King Canute contributed. But he's the figure that's important for the Viking era. But I told you a little bit about Vikings last week, and I need to move on to the Normans because we haven't got there. We're talking about the great people. Now we're going to talk about the Middle Ages, so we need to get into it. There's no assignment this week, by the way, but please make sure by Monday midnight at the latest, that you submit your paper about the Celts, the Romans, the Germans, the Danes, or the Normans. So, if you haven't done it already, I'm going to tell you about the Normans now. So the Normans are kind of, just think of them, I know I'm simplifying some things, and some expert from somewhere or professor watches this video, they're going to be like, hey, Professor Sullivan, that's not what they are. But just bear with me. Basically, they're half Viking, they're half French. Okay, so these Viking people, as I said, they spread all over Europe, and if you're near the water, you're in danger. So northern France had this area that looked really nice to the Vikings. They came over, they raided it, and they settled there. The King of France really didn't have the ability, the money, the power, the technology, or anything to deal with these guys. So the best thing to do was to just say, okay, you can have the land there, but you guys got to become Christian, and you need to be my vassal. So when I need to fight somebody, and I call you, you got to do stuff for me. Like, you're kind of like, I'm your boss. You just do your work over there, and you have your kingdom. It's called a duchy, actually, so the guy's a duke. It's not a king. The King of France just said, okay, you have this area, but you're you're under my umbrella, and you're my vassal, so I control you, right? When I need you, you got to do what I say. It's kind of like a contract. So they did this. They became Christian. They started to speak French. So they changed their language, they changed their religion, and then they got the land, and they became part of France, but not in the sense like of a nation. You got to remember, this is not the same thing. So they're basically a separate country in a way. So the Normans are not French. That's why I said half French, half Viking. So a few generations go by of this, and they became more and more French and more comfortable with Christian. But they didn't give up their Viking side up until, about 1000 AD. Christians were still not comfortable with fighting and killing. You wouldn't know that now because Christians say stuff like you need to use the sword to make people do, you need the sword to be effective, not just the sword. Jesus said that speaking is like a sword, your tongue is a sword. But no, Christians around 1000 AD said, no, we don't need to speak and use your words like a sword. We need actual swords, and we need to cut people up into pieces that don't listen to what we say. The Vikings they were a large part of that because they said, okay, we'll be Christian, but we're not going to stop being fighters. So they sort of transformed into these knights. They started to wear armor, and they started to ride horses and have lances and swords, but they dedicated themselves to their religious belief at the same time, which would not really have worked. Original Christianity was not violent, but again, in going along with the theme of the course, an evolution occurred in Christianity, especially in Northern Europe, where Christian warriors, Christian soldiers became a literal thing. Not like a figurative thing, like we're all soldiers and we're doing work for God, but we're actually fighting for God and killing. So this is what they sort of mishmashed. They mixed their violent heritage and their pagan religions, even sort of creating hybrids of Thor and Odin and Jesus and God and warriors and angels, and all of these things started to mix together, especially in Normandy. Then along came this young man called William. As I said, he was actually speaking French, so his real name is Guillaume, which is French for William. And he was a bastard. So his father cheated on his mother. We'll just put it in simple terms. His father, let's get this right. His mother was not his father's wife. Okay? So she was not a princess or a queen or a duchess, his wife. So he was not supposed to be able to take over for his father. He was one of probably his uncle or a son born from his father's wife would have become the Duke of Normandy. But that's not what happened. He was very resourceful. His father died. He decided he wanted to be the Duke, and he was a really dangerous man, essentially. Really good fighter, great leader, really tough. And so he took over and he became the Duke. Meanwhile, back in England, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom had a lot of things going on, in terms of who was controlling the country. The king was Edward the Confessor, and he was not interested in his wife. We don't really know exactly why, but he loved church, and he was pretty much a good leader in most senses. But one of the most important things about a king is to have children, and he didn't do that, and he didn't seem to be interested in it at all, and didn't really seem to like his wife. So he ruled for over 20 years, and he did a pretty good job of running the country. But after he died, who was supposed to be the next king? Nobody really knew. So there was some Vikings that made a claim up north, and there was William, because William's great-great-grandmother was the wife of Edward the Confessor's great-great-grandfather, something like that. He had a distant relationship. He claimed that it was his birthright to be the King of England, not the guy who said that when Edward died that he'd given the kingdom to him. So there's this guy named Harold. His father was named Godwin, and Godwin was the richest, most powerful person in the kingdom, second only to Edward. So Edward died, and the son of the most powerful person in England, Harold Godwinson, became king. This set up a situation where Harold's brother didn't want him to be king, so he went up north and met a Viking army, and then they decided that they were going to take over England, and at the same time William did too. So in 1066, the Vikings came, and Harold's brother went up and met them, and they razed a bunch of villages and towns and attacked York in the north. Harold took his army up north, surprised the Vikings, killed all of them in just a complete bloodbath, and they just got wiped out. When he was up there, William sailed across the English Channel and landed in southern England. So he turned around. He had just told his men to go home because he was thinking that he would not need them and they had to go back to the farms. But he recalled them and then quickly marched as fast as he could from northern England, central England, down to a place called Hastings to fight against William. Now, there was a battle. It's the most famous battle in English history. If the Anglo-Saxons win, it's an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. If the Normans win, it becomes a Norman kingdom. This is 1066. Remember I told you don't worry about the dates except for a few. 1066. 1066. Every English person knows that date. It doesn't matter if you hate history or you love it. If you don't know that, then you don't know anything. I'm sorry to say, it's true. It's just like 1776, which will be another date that I will insist you know, because 1776 is the beginning of the War of Independence, the American Revolutionary War. And every American knows that date, because that's the beginning of America. Every English person knows this, because this is the end of Anglo-Saxon England and a transformation into a different type kingdom where the Normans control it. So they fight the battle. Harold gets shot in the eye. That's the short version. The fight all day, it was a very close fought battle, but the Normans win. The king is killed, and William goes to London and he gets crowned at Christmas in 1066, I believe. So then what happens? Important things. The Normans, they speak French. They don't want to speak English and they don't know how. So that's why we have so much French language, so many French words in English. So there's the French influence. They ride horses and they wear armor. Not heavy armor like later, but they wear armor and they ride horses. They're knights. They have archers. So the English fought differently. Usually they fought on foot and they had axes and swords and sticks and stuff. They were called huscarls. Now, the type of warrior is knights and archers. And this will be the case for hundreds of years. The Normans really started kind of military revolution, or they were a part of the military revolution of knights and archers, which became basically the main way of fighting during the period. Christianity they brought with them. Anglo-Saxons were already Christian, but in a different way. This Christianity is really closely connected to the Pope, more so than before, and in a different sense, because England was more influenced by Ireland previously. The Anglo-Saxon Christianity was a little bit closer to the Irish version, and this is now Romanized Christianity. So the Roman Catholic Church will be in control, and this will affect everything. There were rich people and powerful owners of land, and there were slaves in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, but it was really, in some ways, less restrictive, and there were a smaller portion of the population was required, to owe their lives and their work to a local lord. But when, basically, like what I said earlier, when William rolls in there and takes over and becomes the king, he's basically an autocrat. In some sense. He basically says, all the land in England belongs to me. So anybody who owns anything doesn't own it anymore. I don't care. It's mine. Sort of the way that somebody like maybe Kim Jong-un or his father or grandfather would think. Like, everything belongs to the state, except for it's not communism, it's mine. Like, in the person. Everybody owes their allegiance directly to me. So if you want something, don't go to your local leader. When the king tells you to do something, everything, all the power is located in the king. So he creates this kind of strict hierarchy with him at the top. He owns everything in England. He gives 30% to the church and 30% to his men, and he keeps 30% for himself, and something like 10% is left over for the rest of the people, which sounds crazy, but there was a lot of resistance, and he cracked down really hard with his soldiers. They built castles all over the place. In the textbook, you can see a picture. The picture is a Norman castle, and in that Norman castle, there would have been some knights. That's it. And those knights are almost like a police force, kind of. So if you were going to be bad in your area and try to make trouble, then they would just hide out in the castle and tell you to behave, or else, the military is going to come. So they would just protect themselves in the castle, and then William or future kings would just send a whole bunch of knights over there, and then they would stomp all over whoever was causing trouble, because they weren't able to take over castles easily. 1,000 peasants with sticks could take down a bunch of knights, but 1,000 peasants with sticks couldn't get into a castle. Even if there was only 20 knights inside, there was nothing they could do once they shut the door. So these Norman castles were almost like police stations that they put all over the place, and they made people behave. And that's part of what people refer to when they say the Norman yoke, is that a small number, only numbering in the 10,000s, controlled the whole country and spoke French. So all the elite people in England for the next couple hundred years, the king included, spoke French as their first language. And it took several hundred years, generations, for the upper class people to be absorbed by the Anglo-Saxons and start speaking English. And that's why English is such a confusing language in terms of spelling and vocabulary. This basic structure is German, but then you got this huge injection of French and Latin and Greek, which came, a lot of it came from not all of it, but a lot of it came from the Normans. Okay, that's William the Conqueror, 1066, don't forget. Now, I'm going to get close to an hour again this time, so let me briefly go through the next things. I really need you to read the textbook, the rest of the chapter, to get through this material so this lecture doesn't get too long. So there's pictures of Norman castles. Here's a few things about the Middle Ages you need to know. First of all, they had this idea called the chain of being, the great chain of being. And this meant that at the top you have God, and below God you have angels, and then you have the Pope and the King, and so on, all the way down the line, all the way through, all the way down to the poorest, weakest person, and then through animals and plants. This idea really comes from Aristotle, who tried to categorize and organize all living things in some sort of ranking. So God at the top, important people underneath him, and then so on through the society, and then to animals and plants. And we still sort of follow this idea today. But they believed that what the king and the Pope and everyone else wanted people to believe is that you belonged somewhere. You were born a poor person, so you should stay there. You should be poor, and you should work hard, because that's what God wants you to do, and that's your place in the universe. You see how neat this works and how great it is? And this theory kind of developed through some various threads, the Bible, and Aristotle, Greek philosophy, and they combined all these things to make this kind of social model that worked well, especially for people at the top. And many people were very religious, and the Bible and learning was mainly taught through Latin and through experts, priests, monks, abbots, bishops, sisters, right? All of these people were sort of trained professionally to do all kinds of things. Don't get me wrong; they also helped the poor. They provided services like funeral rites and advice, counseling, marriage counseling. Like if you have a problem with your marriage, they would be judges that you could go for them for legal advice. They had so many. The church had so many different functions. Everything, and obviously there was a lot of corruption involved because some people were taking advantage of their role. If you made donations or you tried to give money to the church or help the church, some people would take some for themselves. There was lots of, obviously there was so many generous, helpful, honest people, but there was also corrupt, selfish, greedy people that worked in the church. But generally, the church was the way for you to connect internationally. It was the way for you to connect spiritually. It was the meeting place in the center of the town. Everybody was a member of the church. If you look at people today and you think that they're religious, some people are very religious. Most people are not. Like these people though, everyone was super religious at this time. So like I said, imagine you're not living in Korea. Some people are very religious. Lots of people go to church, but they don't have their entire lives revolving. They don't read the Bible every night. They don't think about God and pray all the time. And it's their whole lives do not focus on that. But these people did. And the person that you needed to listen to the most was your priest, right? Your bishop, your priest, the local, anybody who was a representative of the church had a lot of power and influence over everyone. So there was this guy called Henry II, who was a king a few generations after William. He had a really hard time dealing with his archbishop, who was formerly his friend and who he thought would be a great leader for the church, but he was mistaken. He chose this person named Samuel Becket, who had been the financial minister. He was either the chancellor or the exchequer, but he had an important government position. And then when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, the person who's the most important religious leader in England died, Henry was like, oh, I'm going to pick this guy because he's my friend and he understands me and we can get along. And when the king says something, he'll agree with me, and the church and the king and the crown, the church and the government will work together. It'll be awesome. He made Becket the archbishop, and then almost immediately Becket decided that he was going to be a real archbishop, and he was going to use his conscience, and he was going to read the Bible and follow what he thought was best for the church and just completely ignore everything Henry said. So Henry started losing his mind over this. He was known for being having a temper tantrum, like almost like a kid, like when you're in the supermarket and you see one of these kids that they want a toy and their parents say no, and then they fall on the ground and they kick their feet and they just like start screaming. That's called a temper tantrum. Apparently this king, who in other senses was kind of a good king and quite normal, he was super religious, but he was a capable military leader and political leader, but he had no control over his temper. So he would just freak out, fall on the ground, drooling, spitting, scratching, and apparently he used to chew on the carpet. You imagine seeing anybody, Moon Jae-in or Donald Trump or Trudeau or any of the world leaders just like getting so angry they couldn't handle something and then just dropping on the ground and then like eating the carpet? Some of these people. So that's the King of England. So he kept freaking out and having his temper tantrums throughout his life. He had many of these episodes because of Samuel Becket. And in one of these episodes, he said, "Will somebody not rid me of this turbulent priest?" And some of his knights heard him and said, "Well, we can get rid of him." So they went to Canterbury, and they found him, and they tried to drag him out of the church, out of the cathedral, but he wouldn't leave. And people started coming, so the knights kind of panicked, and one of them swung their sword and chopped him in the back of the head, so that split his head open, so that, I won't describe it, but basically it was a gigantic mess. And if you're a Christian or any other religion, you're not, this is Canterbury Cathedral. This is the place where you're not supposed to be violent, and it's God's house. You should not kill the archbishop while he's praying in the holiest place in England. So it was just, the whole country couldn't believe it, and Henry got blamed for it, and he was so unpopular that he apparently was dragged into the church, and one of the churchmen, one of the monks, whipped the king publicly, thrashed his back. Yeah, so that is the kind of thing that happens in medieval life. And none of these things, like I said, some of these things I've explained already. You can see the similarities between English society and our society now. That's not even a horror movie. That's just not going to happen. You're not going to have political leaders ordering other leaders to get killed in special places and then be punished in public by being whipped in front of a group of people. That's never going to happen. Doesn't matter who you are, Park Geun-hye, Moon Jae-in, any other leader. You get in trouble, you go to jail. These kind of events can't happen anymore. They just don't happen. So this is the story of Samuel Becket, which some people claim that he is the first English celebrity, because after he died, they put his bones there, and that was the inspiration. That became one of the most attractive places to visit in England. Now, this is a makeup lecture, and I'm coming up on an hour already. So normally I would have almost 2 hours to speak, but I don't want to make this video any longer than it already is. So I'm going to probably have to squeeze in some of the material from this week into next week, which is fine. I think that's okay. We can stop here with the assassination kind of celebrity story of Samuel Becket. The shrine of Saint Becket, he became a saint. He became a saint. Samuel Becket became the most popular place to visit in England. So people came from all over the place, even from across the Channel and from Ireland and Scotland, all across the United Kingdom and other countries too, just like they would go to Rome, or they would go to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, to make a journey, a pilgrimage, a religious journey to cleanse their soul and make themselves spiritually rejuvenated. So this place where he was murdered became a really important part of British culture, English culture, and British culture later. So we'll talk about that. I am going to briefly talk about the Crusades in a really short description, because this sort of changed, it sort of oriented the United Kingdom and England towards the continent and towards an overseas, effort temporarily. And then that sort of connection and interest starts to fall apart until the early modern period, when they start exploring all over the world, and then England becomes this country that is an empire overseas. But really the first attempt at that sort of came with a connection with William to France and Normandy, and then it expanded all the way down to the Holy Land, to what is now Israel, Palestine, Syria, and Turkey. the Byzantine Empire at the time. It expanded all the way down there, and then, kind of like a balloon that gets the air let out of it, it starts to deflate until England is just back to an island by itself by the end of the 15th century. And there's lots of reasons for that, which I need to explain. So we're going to start next class with the Magna Carta, which is 1215. And we'll go through, talk about Scotland, Scotland briefly, and the Great Famine, the Black Death, which has a lot of relevance, resonates pretty strongly these days. I've never had the opportunity to make a comparison with anything in our real life nowadays until now, but I think you will see some parallels to what is happening with the pandemic now when we talk about the Black Death. And we'll end with Chaucer, Wycliffe, and the end of the Middle Ages, which some people point to as being 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Turks in the east, and the English lost the 100 Years' War. So that's all we can do for today. Thank you for tuning in. This is the lecture for the makeup class. It's from March 2nd, was supposed to be the original class, so this is week 3. And please log in, watch this whole video. I know it's long, but this is what it would be like in real class anyway, so I think this is necessary. So thank you for listening, and we'll continue week 4. Remember, this lecture, just like the other one this week, expires Sunday night, so make sure you get your 90 minutes in this weekend. Thank you for listening.